on the lake. I have to make this story anonymous for several reasons. I think that will become apparent why as the story goes along. I have a small boat, and I tend to deliver some things across the Great Lakes. What I do is not actually legal, so I very often will do this when I can get away with it. That means a lot of times at night, and a lot of times during times of the year when there aren't as many boats on the lake. And I did have a pretty scary time once. And since I didn't fulfill the doctrine of clean hands, I can understand why no one should feel sorry for me. And I don't expect you to do that either. But hopefully at the very least, you'll be able to understand how scary this experience was. I had a shipment I was taking across the lake in November. It was pretty wintry out by that point. If anyone knows anything at all about the condition of the Great Lakes in November, you would know that there are often some extremely windy days. And the day I made this trip, there was a gale warning. And yeah, that should have been enough to convince me not to do it. However, there was a lot of money involved in this trip, so I decided to go ahead and do it. I'm not going to give you an exact area where I was crossing, or tell you where I was going. I'm too nervous to do that. But it was at night. And it had been pretty windy all day, and I was a bit worried about the trip. When I set out, the water was a bit slushy as well. The wind picked up as I went along, and after a while we began to get some freezing rain. It wasn't unusual for me to be out in weather like this, but it was never something you could get used to. I was always somewhat nervous on these trips. I actually will go as far to tell you that that is a good thing. It kept me aware of my surroundings, and this was no different. As the freezing rain was coming down, the waves were also hitting the ship, and it was difficult to keep it steady. I was feeling pretty stupid for even trying this. Money isn't worth anything if your ship sinks and you die at the bottom of a cold lake. As I went further and further along, eventually a thick fog also began rising off of the water, and I just got more and more worried. And that was when it happened. I saw something. There was a big ship on the lake, like really big. But I didn't see it until it was pretty close to me. The ship was completely dark, and it emerged out of the fog. I panicked, and I struggled hard against the wind and the waves to get my boat a safe distance from the huge ship. As I got closer to it, I realized that it was adrift. I knew it was dangerous to be anywhere close to the ship, but I was morbidly curious as to why there was a huge ship and what could possibly be going on. I took out my fog light and shined it on the ship. I was looking for its name. I was unable to find it, though. It was difficult keeping my distance from the ship, struggling in the poor weather and trying to get the name. And then there was a flash. And it took me a second to realize what that flash was. The fog light reflected off a set of eyes. There was someone or something on the boat. I saw the figure from the distance, and they moved away from the flash. However, as I continued to shine the lights, 2 more people joined the first person on the deck. They were looking at me and doing something. I was far away, but I realized that they had a spear gun, and I felt my heart race. This was just the most bizarre and freaky experience of my life. There was a large ship, dark and adrift, on the worst weather possible on the lake. I was doing something illegal, so I couldn't call the authorities. All I could do was try to get away, and I did. Whatever illegal activity I was doing, it couldn't compare to what had to be happening on that ship. And whoever was on that ship seemed completely willing to protect their activities at all costs. Fortunately, I was able to get away from them before anything could happen. I was worried that the ship would suddenly turn around and come after me. I kept expecting to get shot with a spear and have my ship join the Edmund Fitzgerald on the bottom of a lake. But nothing happened. I sped away the best I could, and I got away from that ship pretty quickly. I hope you can understand why this experience was terrifying to me. Cabin. Perhaps the worst thing to ever happen to me happened while I was on winter vacation from work. I always rent a cabin and spend some time alone writing. So for about a month, I lock myself in a nice cabin out in the woods and hope that the snowy weather will inspire me to write a great story. It's really my favorite time of year, even though I spend all of my time alone. I was working on a novel this one year, and I was hoping to finish it off on my vacation. I drove out to the mountains and knew there was a scary winter storm coming. I had all of my groceries and necessities in the car, so it didn't matter to me. In fact, it was the best situation for me. The isolation was something that I just really loved, and it really helped to inspire me. So I was writing, and about a week into my trip, I was writing at night. And then suddenly, I heard what sounded like a shotgun blast. There were not any cabins close to me, and there was definitely no hunting allowed, so the shotgun blast concerned me. Getting up, I walked over to the window and looked out. I didn't see anybody or anything. I stood there for a while, waiting to see if anything was going to happen. And when I finally felt that I was calmed down enough, I decided to go back to my work. I didn't contact the police or anything, because honestly, it wasn't that serious of a thing. Growing up in rural areas, I often heard gunshots in the middle of the night. Lots of people hunted when they weren't allowed to. It wasn't that unusual. The next day I got up and was making my breakfast. I noticed something when I looked out the window. There was what looked like blood stained on the snow. I looked and it was right on the edge of the property. Curious, I went out and I looked over, and it definitely was blood. And there was a light trail of it. I figured, however, that there was just a wounded animal out in the snow. I looked around for it. I really like animals. I guess I figured if one was hurt, I could help it. But I wasn't able to find anything, and I decided that it wasn't very important. I went back to my cabin and went back to work. A day went by, and while I was working, there was a knock at the door. I answered it, and it was the police. I was concerned, and they told me there had been a murder out in the woods, not far from where I was. I was shaking, and I knew that they were going to tell me that it was done with a shotgun. The body had been found out in the woods, and the blood path I had seen had indeed been blood from the victim. The victim was able to get away, but succumbed to his injuries shortly after. They showed me a picture of the man they suspected, and asked me if I had seen him. I had not. Apparently the guy was a bit unbalanced, and I was told to contact the police if I saw him, and that it was the best idea for me to stay inside and keep everything locked up. It's very scary being in a cabin in the woods, with a murderer on the loose. Hell, that's the plot of like 50% of all horror movies ever made. I went through the next couple of days and nights very paranoid. If the man was killed not far from me, that meant that the killer could have been very close. But I convinced myself that he probably hightailed it out of the area. So a few nights passed, and I had mostly put the incident to the back of my mind. I was sleeping in the cabin when I heard a noise wake me up. It was like a window breaking. Of course, I was terrified due to thinking the murderer was breaking into the cabin. I grabbed the knife that I had kept with me for days for protection. I quickly noticed that no one had broken into the cabin. I went to the front and turned the light on. There was a man in my car. The backside window had been broken out, and he had climbed in it. He noticed the light when I turned it on, and I then knew it was the man the police were after, and he was stealing my car. I ran quickly over to the phone to call the police. I kept expecting the man to get out of the car and come after me. However, after a few moments, I heard my car start. He must have hotwired it. And as I talked to the police, he drove off. I was frantic. but happy he had not come after me. It didn't take long before the police tracked him down and arrested him. I could never convey how scared I was when I noticed that man in my car. I thought I was going to die. Fever. I was working at the office when I began feeling a bit ill. I wasn't used to getting sick very much, so I was just hoping it was something that would pass very quickly. However, the icky feeling just kept getting worse, and I found myself getting really, really hot. I hadn't had a fever since I had been a kid, though, and I really didn't know what to do or how to handle it. I decided to go ahead and finish the workday, though. It was tough. However, it did feel good getting out of the office. I was hot, and it was very cold and snowing outside. The cold air felt like $1 million. So when I was driving home, I went ahead and I rolled down the window of the car. It felt great. I stopped at the pharmacy and got myself a thermometer and a thing of NyQuil. Again, being sick wasn't something I was used to, so I really didn't know what else to do. I had seen enough NyQuil commercials that I was certain that was the way to go. I got home, and I was just so weak when I got home. I barely was able to take the NyQuil and get myself into bed. However, I was so miserable and hot that I had to open some of the windows in the house. I didn't need the NyQuil that badly as far as putting me to sleep, though. I plopped down in my bed and immediately passed out. Well, the night was a very strange night for me. I had some really horrible dreams, and would often wake up from them feeling very miserable. I thought I had woke up, but I wasn't sure. I was way too weak to do anything, and even really move. I was just completely uncomfortable. But I had woken up because I thought I heard something. I thought maybe I heard something in the house, but it didn't last very long, and I fell asleep right away again. I was so feverish and out of it that I figured it was just me imagining things. A little later in the night, I'm not sure of what time it was, something woke me up again. But this time, I could have sworn that there was a light on in my house. I shrugged it off again and I went back to sleep. In the morning, I was finally able to get up and move around. However, I was planning on calling into work. I never did that before, but I just really felt like I wouldn't have the strength to do anything. So I just decided to call in from my bedroom. I was also very, very thirsty, so I left my room to get myself a glass of orange juice. The first thing that I noticed when I went into the other room was that I had left the living room window open, and the screen was removed, and there was snow in the apartment. I was about to close the window until I noticed there were some things missing from my apartment. The block with my kitchen knives was missing. I had this really cute block that looked like a person with a bunch of knives through its body. Both it and the knives were gone. I had a couple other tools that were missing too. They were all just weird things to be missing. I mean, why would someone break into my house just to steal some knives? I went to go to the bathroom and went to open the door. When I did, a cascade of knives fell from the ceiling and landed on the floor. There was something keeping them sitting on top of the door. It was done rather poorly, and I was fortunate that I only got a small cut from one of the knives. If someone was trying to kill or hurt me, they did a horrible job at it. But if they were trying to scare me, then they did a really good job. My mind was really messed up from being sick. When I called the police about it, I was hoping to find out that it was someone I knew. It turns out that I was not the only person in that area to report such an incident. Several houses had been broken into, with weird but ineffective booby traps set up. I really wish I could give some closure to this story, but I don't have any myself. It could have been, and probably was, a bunch of teenagers acting like asses. They noticed my window open and thought I would be an easy break-in. I guess I was lucky that I was too immobile to get up and confront them. It's just weird, though, like a weird scene from a cheap horror film, but it was freaky to me. The wind. I love the wind. I love those days when the wind is just blowing everything around. I watch people in the parking lot of a store having their carts blown away. I love the sound of the wind. Most of all, I like the howl of the wind. It is amazing. The house I live in is really soundproof for some reason. Hell, the other day, I had the window open in my room. I heard what seemed like a plane flying an inch above our house. It was weird and very loud. In the other room, my family members didn't hear it at all because the window was closed. So that is basically what it is like to live in this house. I also live in a warmer climate. We rarely get anything like snow, but it does happen once in a while. A lot of the times, our winters consist of thunderstorms or windstorms. Thanks to me liking the wind so much, this is a good thing. We also get very swift and dramatic temperature changes, which make it windy. And the day just happened, it was very windy. I was still in high school at the time, but my entire family was out of town. It had been in the 30s the day before, but the temperature shot up into the 60s the following day. This was in January, so even for our area this was really odd. But we had winds over 20 miles per hour all day and into the night. I was happy that it was so warm outside because it made it possible for me to open the window and listen to the wind. I am a writer, and I'm a bit of a binge writer. While I might not write for days, when I do decide that it is time for me to write, I can write for an entire day. The wind was inspiring, so I decided to spend the day writing. I wrote for most of the day, and well into the night. And I heard all kinds of noises outside the house, but that was to be expected on such a windy day. However, at one point, I heard something that couldn't be explained by the wind. I have central air conditioning, in one of those large outside units with a fan, and I heard a strumming noise. It was as if something was being strummed across the top of the fan cover, and it repeated about 4 times, each time sounding exactly the same. I was alone in my house, and it was dark and windy outside, so my mind automatically went to a bad place. But I looked out the window, and I didn't see anything. The air conditioning unit was right outside my window. Someone could have been behind it, but maybe not able to be seen by me. I thought about it for a minute, and then I decided to go ahead and go outside and look. I was a bit nervous, but forced myself to do it because I didn't want to come across to myself as a chicken. I went out the front door. Okay, I took my cat with me, so I guess I wasn't truly brave. She didn't want to be carried, though, so I let her play around in the front yard, while I went around to the side yard. There was no one in the side yard. I went over to the air conditioning unit, and I checked all around it. There was no one there. Walking around to the other side of the house, I saw no one there either. I went back to the air conditioner. There was a tree in the side yard, but even with the wind, none of the branches could have reached the unit. I walked up to it and looked at the fan. Putting my finger on the fan cover, I ran my finger across the entire cover. Doing so, it made the identical noise that I had heard earlier. I was a bit freaked, and decided to just go back into the house. So I collected my cat and we went back in. I made sure the door was locked, but I did feel better when I got back to my room, and I went back to my writing at that point. After a while of hearing just the wind sounds and nothing creepy, I was soon back to just feeling fine at what I was doing. I was just enjoying myself. There were some other weird sounds coming afterward, but nothing at all like the strumming sound. They were all just normal outside noises that were all attributable to the wind. After a while, I got to a part of the story that I was unable to continue writing. I had to think about what was going to happen next. So I sat back in my chair for a while thinking, looking around the room. After a minute, my eyes went over to the window. It was dark, and looking away from the computer screen, my eyes hadn't adjusted to the lack of the light yet. I kept looking at the window, and as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something outside the window. There was a person standing outside my window, looking in at me. My first reaction was startle. I nearly fell out of my chair. The person looking in my window noticed that I had noticed him. The things that happened in the next few moments all blurred together. It sounded like the guy tried to remove the screen, which wasn't possible from the outside. I regrouped and went over to the window, and as I did, he changed his strategy. He took his pocket knife and thrust his hand through the screen, tearing it terribly. In response, I grabbed the window and slammed it down on his arm. He yelped, but his arm was caught in the window. The pocket knife dropped on the floor. I held his arm there as I tried to figure out who this guy was, and I did recognize him pretty quickly. The surprise at seeing him caused me to momentarily let up on the pressure of the window. This gave him time to wrestle his arm out of the window, and he ran off. I immediately went and called the police, and they showed up quickly. I showed them the knife and the hole in the screen and explained what happened. What happened was that a week prior, I had been attacked by a guy at school named Eric. He hung out with a group of guys who were bullies. They were asses to everyone and got into a lot of trouble. I became his target in the locker room when he thought I was checking him out. I am not gay, and I have no problem with gay guys. I simply looked in his direction at one point, and he got pissed off at me and started calling me a fag. He eventually came over and screamed in my face and pushed me into the locker. I was not injured, but the gym teacher saw it. Eric was suspended from school for 2 weeks for the incident. I guess he was going to try and hurt or scare me for revenge. The police went to his home and he denied everything. His father, first, was very pissed that his son was being accused of something that he did not do. However, when he saw the pocket knife, which he had bought for Eric, everything changed. Eric got in trouble legally for what happened, but from what I heard, that was nothing compared to the whipping he got from his father. You know, I normally don't care for corporal punishment, but I have to admit, however, in this case, it didn't bother me at all. Winter break. This happened quite a long time ago in the 1970s. At the time, I was going to school in Northern California. I was from Minnesota, though. All I had at the time was an old beater of a car that I would use to drive home during school breaks. It was a very long drive that took me through many mountains. I was pretty fortunate that even though the car wasn't that great, I never had any problems with it. That was fortunate because I really didn't know jack about fixing cars. But the car had been my first as a teenager, and it got me to school. It also got me back and forth from school to home for 3 years as a college student. During my senior year in college, I was just finishing up my final exams. I was going to be going home for the winter break. It was exciting, especially knowing that I only had 1 more semester of college left. As normally, I did not leave immediately. I like to avoid the big exodus that happens on the last day of the semester. I waited through the weekend, and then I packed up all my things and made my trip home. I mentioned before that I have to travel through the mountains. The entire trip home would take me a few days. I brought blankets and pillows so I could sleep in my car. I didn't have enough money to spring for a hotel room, and still be able to afford gasoline and to feed myself. I was traveling through the mountains during the second day, and it began snowing really early in the day. I was a bit worried, but thought as long as I drove carefully I would be alright. However, the act of driving carefully then made my trip take more time than I would have liked. The snowfall only got worse and worse as the day had gone along very slowly. I would have liked to get out of the mountains before nightfall, but as the snow fell heavier and heavier, this appeared that it was going to be very unlikely. By night, I was going so slow that I knew for a fact I wouldn't be getting out of the mountains. So I decided that at the very next rest area, I was going to pull into the parking lot and try to get some sleep. Unfortunately, It took me a long time to get to the rest area, and of course, so much snow had fallen at that point that there was no chance that the parking lot would be plowed. Fortunately, however, it must have been salted because it was easier to drive on than the mountain road had been. I figured that it would be much safer for me in all ways to pull in there and wait out the storm. I parked a bit away from the building and then decided to lay in the back seat with my pillows and blankets. Laying in the back seat, I at first just watched the snow fall through the windows of the car. I guess it really wasn't until that point that I realized how stressed out I had been by the falling snow. I was able to relax rather quickly in the back seat of the car, and I fell asleep really quickly as well. I woke up. I thought I heard something. By this point, my windows had been covered with snow and were frozen, but I did hear something, and I felt my car moving a little bit. "Can't you just bust out one of the front windows and open the trunk from the inside?" I heard a voice ask. "No, I know this type of car." I heard another voice respond. "You can only open the trunk with a key." I froze as I realized that someone was trying to break into my car, and it was obviously more than one person. I didn't want to move, and I didn't know what to do. I was just freaked out. As I lay down, I eventually saw someone trying to brush off snow and ice on the back window facing me. It took them a bit, but after a few moments, I saw a pair of eyes staring right at me. I closed my eyes quickly. I heard a guy, now sounding nervous himself, saying that there was someone sleeping in the backseat of the car, and the other guy suggested they break the window and rob me. I was more scared then. I reached under the seat and grabbed a tire iron, and then sat up. It was then that the weirdest thing happened. I don't know if it was because of the window being frozen, but the guy looking in did not see the tire iron as a tire iron. He thought I was holding a gun. He yelled this fact to his friend, with panic in his voice. There was some swearing more than I heard them running off through the snow. Eventually, I heard another car driving off. It happened so quickly that I really didn't know what to think. But I realized how lucky I was that they thought my tire iron was a gun. I wasn't able to fall back asleep after almost being robbed. But I did wait until the snow stopped before going out again. No home. I had a really difficult time when I was in my late teens. I got into a horrible fight with my parents not long after I turned 18. Although they didn't kick me out of their house, I decided I would be a lot happier if I left anyway. So I stormed out of the house with very little to my name. At first, I couch surfed at different friends' houses. However, that couldn't go on forever. And it is amazing how quickly you might get on the nerves of your friends when you are staying in their home for a while. So after a couple of months of doing this, and a complete failure in trying to get a job, I ended up being homeless in the Chicago area. Although I didn't live in the city myself, when I went homeless, I went to the city. It was easier to panhandle there, and that became my main source of income for quite a while. It was sort of late summer when I first went back to the city. That wasn't really that bad. There were parks and easy places like that to find and sleep. Even sleeping in an alley is not that bad when it's warm outside. It was not even bad as it began to get colder. However, when winter hits in a city like Chicago, being homeless can be utter hell. Well, I guess if hell was freezing cold, it would be utter hell. It takes a while before it gets really cold in Chicago. While November and December can be cold, January and February can be completely unbearable. It's not really easy to find squatting houses. There's an underground tunnel in the Lincoln Park Zoo that has tons of homeless people sleeping in it. However, it wasn't particularly warm nor easy to sleep in. One of the most common ways that I had been able to sleep was that if I could get a few bucks so I could ride on the L trains, I could sleep a little bit. However, it wouldn't be for long periods of time. I would have to disembark at the end of the line, get onto another train, and go through that process over and over again. Although I had gone through some very difficult times before the end of the year, I was completely unprepared for how horrible the January weather was going to be. I was determined to find a squatting house. I was sure that it had gotten so cold outside that were I to fall asleep in an alley or something like that, I would get frostbitten all over. Even worse, I might have died. But the problem with a lot of squatting houses is that the people there might not let you in. They may want to get money in order just to let you sleep there. They may just be unwilling to share the space that they have claimed for their own. And they also might just be homeless people that know you and are unwilling to let you find shelter there. I had run into all these things in my desperate search to find a place to sleep. On the night that this story took place, it was unbelievably cold. There was a bank that had a digital sign outside that showed the temperature. I generally used that in order to know exactly what the weather was like. And this night, it was below zero. I wanted to get onto an L train, but I didn't have any money to get in. When I have told people this story before, they tend to always wonder why I didn't just jump over the turnstile and get in the train. Well, the truth is, I just never thought about it before. I also didn't go into McDonald's and steal food from people while they were in the bathroom. I'd only been homeless for a short period of time, and I guess I really didn't get to the point where I was willing to do illegal things yet. After looking around and walking around for a while in order to try and keep warm, I walked down an alley in a bad part of town. Far enough down the alley, there were 3 homeless men who seemed to construct a small fire in a garbage can. When I saw them, they noticed me too, since I had been used to being forbidden entrance to squatting houses and such. I wasn't expecting any kind of greeting by the 3 men, so I froze for a moment before I was going to turn and walk out of the alley. To my surprise, however, the 3 men called me over to the trash can. It was blatantly obvious that I was homeless, and I guess they had found some sympathy for me. They let me come up and warm myself by the trash can. We talked a bit, and although they didn't have any food, they had a bottle of alcohol that they allowed me to have a few drinks out of. After a while, I was able to cuddle up against the wall of the building, and as I began to feel drowsy in the warmth of the fire, and even though I was sitting in an alley, I was comfortable and really able to fall asleep. It was nice sleeping, and it was really sound sleep too. While I was asleep though, I guess my body or mind was a bit worried that I was sleeping so soundly. It's just not something that happens when you're homeless. You try and want to sleep soundly, but you're always on edge or something, prepared for something to happen while you were asleep. While I was sleeping, I kept on feeling like someone was trying to push or move me around or something. I tried to make myself wake up a few times, but I found myself unable to do so. But as these feelings continued, I tried harder and harder to wake up. Finally, after a lot of effort, I was able to force my eyes to open. Everything was hazy, but I could tell that the guys who invited me to sleep there by the fire were pulling my clothing off and using it to feed the fire. I tried struggling a bit, but everything was too hazy and too messed up for me to struggle against the guys. They managed to get most of everything off of me but my underwear, which I suspect was simply because they didn't want to see me naked or anything. A pair of underwear in below freezing weather doesn't do much for anyone though. At that point, I got up and tried to get out of the alley. It was difficult for me to walk without falling over, and I did this a few times. I tried to find my way into a building or something, hopefully to keep myself from getting frostbitten. Not that it would have done me any good, as I was obviously homeless with an ugly beard and ragged hair, and how filthy I was. But it was the only thing I could think of to do. I blacked out, however. I have no memory of getting beyond the boundary of the alley. When I woke up, it seemed like it was much longer afterwards than it was. I was in a hospital bed. I'd been cleaned up and I was in some pain. I also barely was able to tell exactly where I was. A nurse came to talk to me and then brought my mom into the room. To summarize what happened after my memory ended, I stumbled out of the alley into the road and was hit by a car. Fortunately, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, I had written my name on my underwear in case I were to die homeless. I thought it was foolproof ID. There were traces of drugs in my system that I would rather not name, but they were likely in the flask that the homeless guys have given me to drink. That was what had knocked me out, and why I was so groggy when I got up. I had a broken wrist and 2 broken ribs from being hit by the car. I'm able to tell this story because I made up with my parents. I moved back home. I got a job and saved money, and now I'm in college. And this is much, much better than what I put myself through simply because I was being stubborn with my parents. Discovery. I've heard some stories of people having similar experiences to the ones that I sometimes get when I'm hiking. Even though you're hiking out in the forests and hills, you can come across old abandoned barns and sheds. I used to come across all sorts of strange structures when I was out hiking around. I guess the reason that the barns were there was because back in the day people had cows grazing on the hills. However, it had not been that way for quite a long time in my area. For the most part, there wasn't anything special about the abandoned buildings. They were typically empty except for old wooden furnishings and rusted tools. They were still interesting to explore for the simple reason that they were curiosities. I liked to wonder how long they had been abandoned, who had owned them, and what they were used for. I mean, I guess none of that seems really interesting or remotely important, but it was always interesting to me. There was only one time when I ever found an interesting abandoned building while out on a hike. This happened not around my own home, but while my family were visiting relatives in a different state. I was a teenager at the time, and really not at all interested in the conversations my family had. I had been out in the hills by my aunt's house before, but I was nowhere near as familiar with them as I was the area around my own home. And this day I did leave to go hiking rather early in the morning, and I planned on being out for the whole day. Well, although I went hiking a lot, I still tended to occasionally get lost. And this was one of those times that this happened. I just did it for fun. I didn't bring a compass or anything like that. I also have no talent in looking at the sky and knowing which direction I'm going in. So I ended up being out a lot later than I expected to be, and I was trying to find my way home. When I went over a hill, I noticed a moderate-sized barn at the bottom of the hill. Even though it wasn't really a good idea, as I was lost and trying my best to find my way home, I decided I wanted to go and check out the barn. It was unlikely I would ever have the chance to see the structure again. By the time I got down the hill, I looked up at the sky. Although I couldn't tell where I was, I could tell that there would not be a lot of light left in the day. I decided that no matter what, I would be doing some hiking in the dark, so there was no real reason I shouldn't check out the barn. I couldn't get the normal smaller door opened, so I realized I would have to open the big front barn doors, if I could. Again, I almost considered just forgetting about it and deciding to find my way home, but I did decide I would give it a shot. It took a bit of effort, but I was able to open one of the front barn doors. There wasn't a lot of light, and with the area the barn was in, there was really no way to get much light in it. Fortunately, I had brought a flashlight with me in case I got caught out in the dark, so I took it out and began shining it around the barn. I walked around as I shined the flashlight around. There wasn't a whole lot to see. It was obvious that this place had been abandoned for a very long time. And then I froze, and I saw something weird, laying up against an old pile of gross and moldy hay. And when I came in for a closer look, I froze again when I realized what I was seeing. A long, dead, decayed body was lying up against the hay. There was a pitchfork sticking through the neck of the body and into the hay. The body was so old that there was very little I could actually tell about it. It was mostly bones and clothes and other gross stuff that I really don't want to know what it was. But it was undoubted that the person died from a pitchfork to the throat, and seeing how the body was still in the abandoned barn after all this time, it pretty much made sense that it was likely a murder. After I got through the shock, I closed the barn door and left. I wasn't scared that something would happen to me. Again, this possible murder had happened a long time ago. There was no reason to believe I was in any danger, but it doesn't mean I wasn't scared. My mind was full of ideas about how and why the man was killed. Thinking about that, and why, and wondering how long the person was missed, or looked for, or anything, just created a bunch of unpleasant thoughts. And those were the scariest. I had been out in the dark for a while, when I eventually did get back to my aunt's house. I explained what happened and they called the county sheriff the following day. The details really aren't that important. The man who had owned the barn had also died a long time ago, so it was unlikely anything would ever be discovered as to why the man was killed. In a way, that's one of the scariest things about the whole experience. Warnings. This story might seem a bit incredible at first, and by that, I don't mean what a lot of people assume that word means. It means that it'll be hard to believe, and I have little doubt that some people will not believe me. That is fine, of course, and I won't hold it against anyone, but this is a true story. Me and my buddy Joel went hiking one fall. I always preferred hiking in the fall because it was cooler outside, and I also liked the colors of the trees more in the fall. We liked to go to different places all the time. We may have gotten lost once or twice before, but that was not something that was very usual. We were both very experienced hikers. The first couple of days and nights, nothing really happened. We had a nice time hiking, but there was nothing unusual. It was very casual, cool hike through the woods. We didn't see a lot of wildlife apart from birds and a few small animals. That wasn't too unusual for the time of year that we went hiking. We did expect to see some deer or something like that. For the most part, there was nothing too out of the ordinary that we came across. It was like any other camping and hiking trip. The third morning was when something weird happened. The night had passed as normally as any other night before it. Again, nothing unusual. But when I got up and was getting ready to make something to eat, something caught my eye over there on Joel's tent. It was like a yellow vertical line painted on his tent. I hadn't noticed it before, and I just figured I'd ask him about it when he woke up. I went about making breakfast, and I guess the smell of it woke Joel up. He always slept a bit later than I did. But he got up, and after going behind a tree for a few moments, he came over to the fire to get something to eat. And when he did, however, he had a strange and quizzical look on his face. "What's that on your tent?" he asked me. Looking back to where he was pointing, I then noticed it for the first time. There was a yellow vertical line on my tent, too. I mentioned I had seen one on his tent, and then he looked back on it, and noticed it too. He confirmed that he had nothing to do with either line. I cannot tell you if I believed him or not, because honestly I didn't know. Joel wasn't much of a prankster or a liar. Hell, even if he was, painting a yellow line on a tent would be one of the lamest practical jokes I could even imagine. I mean, what would it even mean? We didn't think very much about it after that. I guess on some level both of us expected that the other one was responsible, and it was easy to put out of our minds. The following morning I got up and exited my tent to get ready for breakfast. This time, when I looked at the tents, I noticed something else. A second vertical line was drawn right beside the first one. I checked out both tents, and they were on both tents. So at that point, I was positive that Joel had something to do with it. When Joel got up, I told him that he might as well admit his joke to me. He seemed confused at first, until he noticed it too. "Why would you think I had anything to do with that?" he asked me. My only response to him was that if I hadn't done it, then he must have. Joel countered that it made more sense to him that I was playing a practical joke. I always woke up before him, and he was a sounder sleeper than me. Probably not shockingly, things were a bit tense that day. Both of us seemed convinced that the other one was behind what was going on. I mean, we were not mad at each other. We still had a really good time. But we were both wary of each other. It was obvious. I guess that alone should have told me that neither of us were responsible. But it's easier to see those things when you are removed from the situation. The next few mornings were pretty much the same. On the 5th morning, we saw something that finally explained what the vertical lines meant. Rather than a 5th vertical line on our tents, there was a diagonal line cutting through the previous 4. It was someone counting something down, counting the days until something happened maybe. That in itself was odd, but it was nothing like what happened the following morning. I stepped on something sticky. When I looked down, there was a puddle of blood right outside my tent. I looked immediately over at Joel's tent. Yeah, he had a puddle of blood right in front of his tent too. I got Joel up, and I think for the first time, neither of us suspected the other of playing a joke or anything. Someone else was doing those things while we were sleeping. And for the first time, I think the two of us were a little frightened. And to top everything off, there was another vertical line drawn after the 5 count. The following morning I was very careful in coming out of my tent. This time there was no puddle of blood, however. There were a couple of dead birds in front of my tent, and a couple in front of Joel's tent also. At this point, the frightened feelings began to turn into fear, and of course, there was another vertical line on each of our tents. Joel and I had a discussion about what we thought we should do. Someone was fucking with us, but we had no way of knowing if they were just fucking with us, or if it was something serious here. We decided that we would try and remain awake the following night. If someone was riding on our tents and leaving blood and dead animals in our campsite, then we would be able to catch them if we stayed up. And because we both couldn't stay up all night, we set up little shifts and set our watches so we would know when the other was awake. I figured that whatever was going on, we were going to figure out that night. I went and took the first shift. It was scary, I won't deny it. I mean, it was scary enough when the sun went down, but it was much scarier when I could hear Joel snoring from his tent. At that point, a bit of paranoia began to set in. I felt not only scared but alone. I also had nothing to keep my mind occupied. I couldn't use anything with lights or noise, because that would give away that I was awake. So all I had to keep me occupied were my thoughts, and that was not really the best idea. Generally you become habituated to the noise out in the woods, but I was hearing everything very loud and very clear. The crickets, the frogs, and every other sound was just magnified, and all the time I was expecting to see or hear something, whether that would be the light of a flashlight, or hearing someone approaching or talking. What I feared most, though, was seeing someone in silhouette, painting a vertical line on the outside wall of my tent. Time went by really slow. Although my anticipation was high, nothing did happen during my shift. When Joe indicated to me that he was awake, I went to sleep. And I assumed because I was so tired that I would fall asleep rather quickly. And I did. But it was very rough sleeping throughout the night. I was confused in the morning, though. A decapitated deer's head was sitting by our fire. Once again, a vertical line appeared on my tent. Joel and I were both confused. Not only that, we were sure that the other one of us either slept during our watch or missed something, but we couldn't decide what. Once again, I began getting a little suspicious of him, but he also seemed to get that way about me. In the end, we decided not to blame each other for anything that was going on. We just decided that there was something going on, and obviously someone that did not want us in those woods. We didn't know what the numbers were counting up to, but also we didn't want to find out. So we decided to find the fastest way that we could to get out of that area. Interestingly enough, when we changed our course, the strange happening stopped. That made us both realize that we must have been headed towards something that someone did not want us to see, and we were fine for not seeing it. We, however, did not choose to spend our entire time out there. We got out and never went back. Camping. This is not a really long story, and when it comes down to it, the scariness of it is something that is realized more than experienced. I'll explain. I enjoy going on short hiking trips by myself. They're not like these week-long trips that you sometimes hear about in these stories. This was just a weekend camping trip in the area around my home. It's a rural area, but it's not like, Blair Witch Project woods. You weren't going to get lost and travel around for days. You may get lost for a few hours, but you always find your way out. Now, I like going on these short little trips just to unwind a bit. As I mentioned, they are just on weekends. I spend some time hiking. There are some really nice creeks and waterfalls in the area. There are a lot of birds and small wildlife, but there are not really any dangerous animals or anything like that. So, all in all, these are just very relaxing trips. The most important thing to note, though, that these are not national parks or anything like that. They are private property, owned by the people I rent my home from, and I do have permission from them to do this. But this happened about 3 years ago. I got out hiking and camping. Heading out on a Friday afternoon, I walked along the creeks and camped near the waterfalls. This was very early fall, and the leaves had already changed and were fully falling by this point. I always enjoyed the sound of the scrunching of the leaves being walked upon. I even heard a few woodpeckers, which was cool. But all in all, it was a pleasant trip. About a week later, I got a small package in the mail. There was no return address on it, and it was sent using regular stamps. Opening it, I discovered one of those small USB flash drives. Confused, I decided to put it in my PC and see what was there. And what I saw terrified the hell out of me. There were dozens of video files, and each one of them was of my camping trip the previous weekend. The normal videos alone were scary enough. There were some of me hiking, setting up camp. There were some of me eating and things like that. But the truly scariest part of all the videos was the one that took place on the first night when I was camping by the waterfall. I was asleep in my tent. The only light was the light of the fire that I had built. In this video, I could hear crunching of the leaves. The perspective of the video was from the person, who I had no idea who it was, walking closer and closer towards my camp. He approached the fire, and I watched as someone's hands warmed themselves by the fire. After that, the person recording got up and walked over to my tent. I could see a shadow of my own body inside the tent. I could hear myself snoring lightly. The unknown person walked around my tent. He then flicked open a pocket knife. Now, even though I had experienced the camping trip, it was over, and I knew that I had not been injured in any way. I felt a lot of fear watching that. He fiddled with the knife, walking around the tent for a few minutes, then traced the tip of the blade against the tent, not waking me up. After several moments of doing that, the video ended. I was just in shock and had no idea what to do. I didn't know who this was. I could tell just by the look of the hands that it was not the people who owned this land. And when I contacted them, they hadn't given anyone else permission to be there. The evidence was given to the police, but it was pretty much useless. The package was sent using regular stamps, so there was no way to track it. 3 years later, I still have absolutely no idea at all who had done this. I also have not been back camping in that area since. I just don't feel safe there anymore. The walk. I haven't shared this story very often, and it really bothers me to even think back on it. But I thought maybe sharing it will exercise some of the issues that I have with it. I lived outside of town when I was a teenager. I don't really want to call it rural, because it wasn't. But there were some hills and fields and beautiful trees in the area. I used to take long walks in the hills and the fields. It was peaceful and it just made me really happy. But this happened to me on a lazy summer day. Well, it started out lazy. It was nice and sunny out, and I was taking a real long walk. I was quite far away from my house, and I noticed some really dark clouds start to roll in. I was worried, of course, because I do not like the idea of getting wet. And these black clouds moved in very, very quickly. And this was followed by a huge drop in air pressure, which caused a really cool and strong wind to move in. Hell, it seemed like mere minutes before my sunny day was gone. The sky was black, the wind was strong, and that was when the first lightning bolt blazed across the sky, and the crack of thunder made me nearly jump out of my skin. Of course, then I began walking in the direction of home. It would take me a long while to get there, and by then it was a foregone conclusion that I would be getting very wet. But I really didn't have much of a choice. It hadn't begun raining when I was walking down a hill. I remember slipping on some leaves and sliding down the hill just a little. And it was then that the drops of water began lightly falling out of the sky. I grabbed onto a tree and used that to pull myself up. The lightning and thunder was cracking hard in the sky, lighting the dark landscape. While I was leaning on the tree, brushing some of the leaves and dirt off of me, there was a huge bolt of lightning, and everything was white for a couple of seconds. And that is when I saw it. There were two people in the field that I was about to descend into. Since I was on the hill behind a tree and it was dark, I was sure they couldn't see me. But during that bright bolt of lightning, I watched one person stabbing the other person in the chest. I will admit, at first I wasn't completely sure. I only saw them for a brief moment. However, with the next bolt of lightning, it was confirmed. The victim had fallen to the ground and was kicked a couple times by the stabber. So just as quickly, it was dark again and I couldn't see them. I guess it further sucked because this was the moment that the rain finally began to fall and fall hard. I don't know if you've ever been stung by raindrops, but that was what was happening. I don't know how long I stood there. It was just way too stunning. And I was scared to death because I had just witnessed a knife attack. And as far as I knew at that moment, it wasn't just a knife attack. It could have been murder. I had no idea if the person was alive or dead. I also didn't know what to do. I was terrified that if the person saw me, that I would become the second victim. And I was only able to see what was going on when the occasional lightning bolt lit up the area. The next time it happened, the stabber was gone. Or at least, he was not where I had first seen him. You see, I didn't know where to look for him. I didn't know if he ran off or if he saw me and was coming after me. And while I stood there, I decided I had to go up to the person who was stabbed. If he was still alive, I'd have to see if I could help him. But it was terrifying because I had no idea where the stabber was, or what he was capable of. The rain was still stinging, and I went to the rest of the way, down the hill. I slid again and landed on my ass. I then got back up and started running towards the victim. Each second I expected the stabber to come at me from nowhere, almost as if there would be a flash of lightning, and he would be right there. When I got to the victim, he was still alive. The rain was hitting us hard. I wasn't sure what I could do because we were out in the field. He had 2 wounds and he was obviously in shock. I asked the man if he thought he could walk if he leaned on me, and he was willing to try. I tried asking him what happened, but he couldn't talk about it. I asked him if the guy would come back, and he didn't know. I got him to his feet. I was able to get him to a neighbor's house. He lost a lot of blood, but he lived. Hell, I kept expecting the attacker to come back and finish him off, and then maybe attack me. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Surprise. The scariest thing to ever happen to me happened during a really bad thunderstorm. It happened when I was pretty young, I believe 12 years old. Both of my parents worked, and I would always be home alone for a few hours after I got out of school. I was always very well behaved and careful. I didn't even let my friends in school know that I would be home by myself. I also never answered the door if anyone came to it, and basically pretended like I was not home until my parents got there. I lived in a town where nearly everyone walked to and from school. This day, there was only a half day of school. I cannot remember exactly why, but I think there were teacher meetings or something like that. But from the moment I got up, I could tell it was going to be a stormy day. Dark clouds were in the sky and they were moving really fast. It was also windy. However, despite the stormy atmosphere, it didn't rain at all when I was at school. It was distracting because I always liked storms, and I spent most of the day just staring out the windows. It wasn't a big deal because teachers did not really do much teaching on those half days. I stayed behind just a little while so I can get a couple things done before going home. I'm sure you've had those days when a storm is bearing down on you for hours, but it takes forever for it to start raining. This was one of those days. In fact, after I left school, I was able to get all the way home without it beginning to rain. It was only after I was home for at least an hour that the rain finally started falling. And it was falling fast. We had been getting thunder and lightning all day already. And it was complementing the rain at this point. I was a bit scared, as I really was not brave during storms, even though I did like them. And that was when someone knocked on our door. I mentioned before that I never answered the door when my parents were not home. He kept knocking for a couple of minutes and then stopped. I took a peek out the window and noticed that it was a guy. He was soaked and I did not recognize him. I did my best not to be seen by him, though. After the guy stopped knocking, he stepped off the porch, and then he looked around. And then he did something that was really weird. He walked off the front walk and walked through the yard looking at our house. I had to stop watching him because I was worried I would be caught. I went down to the basement, which was a full finished basement, and set up like a family room. I was getting ready to do my homework, and then I decided that I needed something to drink. I got up and went into the kitchen. I poured a drink, and decided to look out the back of the house and see how the storm was doing. I could hear the rain beating down on the house, and there was a bunch of thunder and lightning. I went to the sliding glass door that led into our backyard. It had vertical blinds that I needed to open, and when I did, I dropped my glass on the floor in shock. The man that I'd seen knocking on the door was on our back porch. He was actually standing right on the other side of the sliding glass door, and he was obviously trying to break into the house. Of course, I was shocked to see the guy, but he was shocked to see me too. I guess he had assumed what I wanted him to. By not answering the door, he must assume that no one was home, and he was trying to break into the house. It was only by pure chance that I caught him. Terrified, I closed the blinds, and then I grabbed the phone and called 911 and then my parents. The police arrived first, but the guy was gone by that point. We assumed that he was realizing that he was trying to break into a house that was not empty. Then he must have ran off. To this day, I still remember the feeling, being so close to that man trying to break into our house. It didn't help that I was already scared of the storms, and it got much worse after that. Monsoon, not gorilla. I called it a monsoon, although technically it was not one, but the rain was coming down really hard, and the wind was blowing at 22 miles per hour. Yeah, I'm one of those dorks who pulls up the Weather Channel every day to look and see how strong the wind was. I own a really small farm. So anyways, this is not a long story, but it is a weird one, and a scary one to me, and it was terrifying when it happened. It was at nighttime, and yes, the wind was blowing pretty hard. I was with my family in the house. My son ran up to me and told me that he saw a man that he didn't know going into the barn. I didn't immediately think anything bad was going on, though. I just assumed that maybe someone had been out in the storm and needed shelter. But then when I walked over to the window, and I noticed the barn door was open, I began thinking differently. I mean, why didn't the guy just come to the door of the house? It would have been better. I grabbed the flashlight and decided to go check the barn. I told the kids and wife to remain in the house. They locked the door and I had my rifle with me. I didn't feel comfortable at all. The wind was so fierce and it was dark and I had no idea what was going on. I didn't even go into the barn to confront whoever it was. Halfway to the barn, I heard the unmistakable noise of my chainsaw being revved up. I felt like my heart leapt into my throat. I mean, yeah, I had a rifle, but chainsaws are just freaking scary. And the person emerged from the barn with a chainsaw. I threw down the flashlight. I wasn't going to mess around. I pointed the rifle at the man who I still did not recognize. I didn't get a chance to do anything, though. Right then, a huge gust of wind hit both of us. To my terror, I lost my rifle onto the ground. I was terrified, but then I heard a scream. The wind also knocked the chainsaw out of balance and into the man's leg. He stupidly had his hand on the throttle, so it cut into him and he fell over. He dropped the chainsaw. I grabbed my rifle and I went close to the man. It was then that I recognized him. He had come to the farm earlier and was trying to get work. The farm is so small and I'm able to handle it with my boys and one worker. I turned him down and I guess he got pissed off and was going to scare or hurt me. My wife had called the police, and they arrived while I had the rifle pointed at the man. He was arrested and charged, but it was aggravated assault, not attempted murder. He got 90 days in jail, and I never came in contact with him again.